The Secret Doctrine by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, a facsimile of the original edition of 1888, printed by the Cunningham Press, Alhambra, California. Book 2, Part 1, Anthropogenesis Stanzas translated with commentaries, from the Secret Book of John. Stanza 12, the fifth race and its divine instructors. Verse 47. Few men remained, some yellow, some brown and black, and some red remained. The moon-colored of the primitive divine stock were gone forever. This verse, 47, relates to the fifth race. History does not begin with it, but living and ever-recurring tradition does. History, or what is called history, does not go further back than the fantastic origins of our fifth subrace, a quote, few thousands, unquote, of years. It is the subdivisions of this first subrace of the fifth root race which are referred to in the sentence, some yellow, some brown and black, and some red remained. The moon-colored, that is, the first and the second races, were gone forever, without leaving any traces whatever, and that so far back as the third deluge of the third Lemurian race, that great dragon whose tail sweeps whole nations out of existence in the twinkling of an eye. And this is the true meaning of the verse in the commentary which says, the great dragon has respect but for the serpents of wisdom, the serpents whose holes are now under the triangular stones, that is, the pyramids at the four corners of the world. Verse 48. The fifth race, produced from the holy stock, remained. It was ruled by her first divine kings. Verse 49. The serpents who redescended, who made peace with the fifth race, who taught and instructed it. This tells us clearly that which is mentioned more than once elsewhere in the commentaries, namely that the adepts or wise men of the three races, the third, fourth, and the fifth, dwelt in the subterranean habitats, generally under some kind of a pyramidal structure, if not actually under a pyramid. For such pyramids existed in the four corners of the world and were never the monopoly of the land of the pharaohs, though until found scattered all over the two Americas, under and overground, beneath and amidst virgin forests, as in plain and vale, they were supposed to be the exclusive property of Egypt. If the true geometrically correct pyramids are no longer found in European regions, many of the supposed early Neolithic caves of the colossal triangular pyramidal and conical menhirs in the Morbihan and Brittany generally, many of the Danish tumuli, and even the, quote, giant tombs, unquote, of Sardinia, with their inseparable companions, the Nuraghi, are so many, more or less clumsy copies of the pyramids. Most of these are the works of the first settlers on the newly born continent and isles of Europe. The, quote, some yellow, some brown and black, and some red, unquote, races that remained after the submersion of the less Atlantean continents and islands 850,000 years ago, with the exception of Plato's Atlantean island, and before the arrival of the great Aryan races, while others were built by the earliest immigrants from the East. Those who can hardly accept the antiquity of the human race so far back as the 57,000 years assigned by Dr. Dowler to the skeleton found by him at New Orleans on the banks of the Mississippi will, of course, reject these facts. But they may find themselves mistaken some day. It is the foolish self-glorification of the Arcadians who styled themselves proselenoi, older than the moon, and of the people of Attica, who claimed that they had existed before the sun appeared in heaven, that we may disparage, not their undeniable antiquity. Nor can we laugh at the universal belief that we had giant ancestors. The fact that the bones of the mammoth and mastodon, and in one case those of a gigantic salamander having been mistaken for human bones, does not make away with the difficulty that, of all the mammalians, man is the only one whom science will not allow to have dwarfed down, like all other animal frames, from the giant Homo diluvi to the creature between 5 and 6 feet that he is now. But the serpents of wisdom have preserved their records well, and the history of the human evolution is traced in heaven as it is traced on underground walls. Humanity and the stars are bound together indissolubly, because of the intelligences that ruled the latter. Modern symbologists may scoff at this and call it fancy, But it is unquestionable that the deluge has ever been associated in the legends of some Eastern peoples not only with the pyramids, but also with the constellations, writes Mr. Staniland Wake in The Great Pyramid. The old dragon is identical with the Great Flood, says Mr. Proctor in Knowledge Volume 1, page 243. Quote, we know that in the past the constellation of the dragon was at the pole, or boss, of the celestial sphere. In stellar temples, the dragon would be the uppermost or ruling constellation. It is singular how closely the constellations correspond in sequence and in range of right ascension with the events recorded respecting the biblical flood. Unquote. The reasons for this singularity have been made clear in this work, but it shows only that there were several deluges mixed up in the memories and traditions of the sub-races of the fifth race. The first great, quote, flood, unquote, was astronomical and cosmical, while several others were terrestrial. Yet this did not prevent our well-learned friend Mr. Gerald Massey, an initiate truly in the mysteries of the British Museum, still only a self-initiate, from declaring and insisting that the Atlantean submersion and deluge were only the anthropomorphized fancies of ignorant people, and that Atlantis was no better than an astronomical allegory. Nevertheless, the great zodiacal allegory is based upon historical events, and one can hardly interfere with the other. And it stands also to reason that every student of occultism knows what the astronomical and zodiacal allegory means. Smith shows in the Nimrod epic of the Assyrian tablets the real meaning of it. Its 12 cantos refer to the annual course of the sun through the 12 months of the year. Each tablet answers to a special month and contains a distinct reference to the animal forms in the signs of the zodiac. The 11th canto being consecrated to Rimmon, the god of storms and of rain, and harmonizes with the 11th sign of the zodiac, Aquarius, or the waterman. Unquote from 19th century, 1882, page 236. But even this is preceded in the old records by the pre-astronomical cosmic flood, which became allegorized and symbolized in the above zodiacal or Noah's flood. But this has nothing to do with Atlantis. The pyramids are closely connected with the ideas of both the great dragon, the constellation, the dragons of the wisdom, or the great initiates of the third and fourth races, and the floods of the Nile, regarded as a divine reminder of the great Atlantic flood. The astronomical records of universal history, however, are said to have had their beginnings with the third sub-race of the fourth root race, or the Atlanteans. When was it? Occult data show that, even since the time of the regular establishment of the zodiacal calculations in Egypt, the poles have been thrice inverted. We will presently return once more to this statement. Such symbols as are represented by the signs of the zodiac, a fact which offers a handle to materialists upon which to hang their one-sided theories and opinions, have too profound a signification, and their bearing upon our humanity is too important to suffer dismissal in a few words. Meanwhile, we have to consider the meaning of that other statement which mentions in verse 48 the first divine kings, who are said to have re-descended, guided and instructed our fifth race after the last deluge. Serpents and dragons under different symbolisms. The name of the dragon in Chaldea was not written phonetically, but was represented by two monograms, probably meaning, according to the Orientalists, the scaly one. This description very pertinently remarks G. Smith, of course might apply either to a fabulous dragon, a serpent, or a fish, and we may add it applies in one case to Makara, the 10th zodiacal sign, meaning in Sanskrit a nondescript amphibious animal, generally called crocodile, and really signifying something else. Vide part 2, the mysteries of the Hebdomad. This, then, is a virtual admission that the Assyriologists, at all events, know nothing certain as to the status of the dragon in ancient Chaldea, whence the Hebrews got their symbolism, only to be afterwards robbed of it by the Christians, who made of the scaly one a living entity and a maleficent power. A specimen of dragons, winged and scaled, may be seen in the British Museum. Representing the events of the fall according to the same authority, there are also two figures sitting on each side of a tree and holding out their hands to the apple, while at the back of the tree is the dragon serpent. Esoterically, the two figures are two Chaldees, ready for initiation, the serpent symbolizing the initiator, while the jealous gods who curse the three are the exoteric profane clergy. Not much of the literal biblical event there, as any occultist can see. The great dragon has respect but for the serpents of wisdom, says the stanza, thus proving the correctness of our explanation of the two figures and the serpent. The serpents who redescended, who taught and instructed the fifth race. What sane man is capable of believing in our day that real serpents are hereby meant? Hence the rough guess now become almost an axiom with the men of science, that those who wrote in antiquity upon various sacred dragons and serpents either were superstitious and credulous people, or were bent upon deceiving those more ignorant than themselves. Yet from Homer downwards the term implies something hidden from the profane. Terrible are the gods when they manifest themselves, those gods whom men call dragons. And Elianis, treating in his De Natura Animalium of these Ophidian symbols, makes certain remarks which show that he understood well the nature of this most ancient of symbols. Thus he most pertinently explains with regard to the above Homeric verse, "For the dragon, while sacred and to be worshipped, has within himself something still more of the divine nature, of which it is better for others, to remain in ignorance." From Book 11, Chapter 17. This dragon, having a septenary meaning, the highest and the lowest may be given. The former is identical with the self-born, the Logos, the Hindu Aja. He was the second person of the Trinity, the Son, with the Christian Gnostics called the Nasenians, or serpent worshippers. His symbol was the constellation of the dragon. Note, as shown by H. Lizerie in the Trinité chrétienne de Voilet, placed between the immutable Father, the pole, a fixed point, and mutable matter, the dragon transmits to the latter the influences received by him from the pole, whence his name, the verbum. End of note. Its 7 stars are the 7 stars held in the hand of the Alpha and Omega in Revelation. In its most terrestrial meaning, the term dragon was applied to the wise men. This portion of the religious symbolism of antiquity is very abstruse and mysterious, and may remain incomprehensible to the profane. In our modern day it so jars on the Christian ear that it can hardly escape, all civilization notwithstanding, being regarded as direct denunciation of the most cherished Christian dogmas, the subject of which required, to do it justice, the pen and genius of Milton, whose poetical fiction has now taken root in the Church as revealed dogma. Did the allegory of the dragon and his supposed conqueror in heaven originate with St. John and in his Revelation? Emphatically we answer no. His dragon is Neptune, the symbol of Atlantean magic. To demonstrate the negation, the reader is asked to examine the symbolism of the serpent or the dragon under its several aspects. The sidereal and cosmic glyphs. Every astronomer, besides occultists and astrologers, knows that, figuratively, the astral light, the Milky Way, and also the path of the Sun to the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, as well as the circles of the sidereal or tropical year, were always called the serpents in the allegorical and mystic phraseology of the adepts. This, cosmically as well as metaphorically. Poseidon is a dragon, Kotsar, called by the profane Neptune. Perativa, reads Gnostics, the good and perfect serpent, the Messiah of the Naseni, whose symbol in heaven is Draco. But one ought to discriminate between the characters of this symbol. For instance, Zoroastrian esotericism is identical with that of the sacred doctrine, and when, as an example, we read in the Vendidad complaints uttered against the serpent, whose bites have transformed the beautiful eternal spring of Aria Navaego, changing it into winter, generating disease and death, at the same time as mental and psychic consumption, every occultist knows that the serpent alluded to is the North Pole, as also the pole of the heavens. Note, symbolized by the Egyptians under the form of a serpent with a hawk's head. End of note. The latter produces the seasons according to the angle at which it penetrates the center of the earth. The two axes were no more parallel, hence the eternal spring of Airiana Vaego by the good river Daitya had disappeared, and the Aryan Magi had to emigrate to Sagdiani, say the exoteric accounts. But the esoteric teaching states that the pole had passed through the equator, and that the land of bliss of the fourth race, its inheritance from the third, had now become the region of desolation and woe. This alone ought to be an incontrovertible proof of the great antiquity of the Zoroastrian scriptures. The Neo-Aryans of the post-Diluvian age could hardly recognize the mountains, on the summits of which their forefathers had met before the flood, and conversed with the pure Yazdas, celestial spirits of the elements, whose life and food they had once shared. As shown by Eckstein in Revue Archaeologique 8th year 1885, the Vendidad seems to point out a great change in the atmosphere of Central Asia, strong volcanic eruptions, and the collapse of a whole range of mountains in the neighborhood of the Karakoram chain. The Egyptians, according to Eusebius, who for once and for a wonder wrote the truth, symbolized cosmos by a large fiery circle representing a serpent with a hawk's head lying across its diameter. Quote, "Here we have the pole of the earth within the plane of the ecliptic, attended with all the fiery consequences that must arise from such a state of the heavens, when the whole zodiac in 25,000-odd years must have reddened with the solar blaze, and each sign must have been vertical to the polar region." Unquote. See Mackey's Sphinxiad. Meru, the abode of the gods, was placed, as before explained, in the North Pole, while Patala, the nether region, was supposed to lie in the south. As each symbol in esoteric philosophy has 7 keys geographically, Meru and Patala have one significance and represent localities, while astronomically they have another and mean the 2 poles, which meaning ended by their being often rendered in exoteric sectarianism, the mountain and the pit, or heaven and hell. If we hold at present only to the astronomical and geographical significance, it may be found that the ancients knew the topography and nature of the Arctic and Antarctic regions better than any of our modern astronomers. They had reasons, and good ones, for naming one the mountain and the other the pit. As the author just quoted half explains, Helion and Acheron meant nearly the same. Helion is the sun in the highest, Helios, Helion, the most high, and Acheron is 32 degrees above the pole and 32 below it, the allegorical river being thus supposed to touch the northern horizon in the latitude of 32 degrees. The vast concave that is forever hidden from our sight, and which surrounded the southern pole, being therefore called the pit, while observing toward the northern pole that a certain circuit in the heavens always appeared above the horizon, they call it the mountain. As Meru is the high abode of the gods, these were said to ascend and descend periodically, by which astronomically the zodiacal gods were meant, the passing of the original north pole of the earth to the south pole of the heaven. In that age, as the author of that curious work, the Sphinxiad, and of Urania's Key to Revelations, quote, "At noon the ecliptic would be parallel with the meridian, and part of the zodiac would descend from the North Pole to the north horizon, crossing the 8 coils of the serpent, 8 sidereal years, or over 200,000 solar years, which would seem like an imaginary ladder with 8 staves reaching from the earth up to the pole, that is, the throne of Jove. Up this ladder, then, the gods, that is, the signs of the zodiac, ascended and descended. Jacob's ladder and the angels. It is more than 400,000 years since the zodiac formed the sides of this ladder." Unquote. This is an ingenious explanation, even if it is not altogether free from occult heresy. Yet it is nearer the truth than many of a more scientific and especially theological character. As just said, the Christian Trinity was purely astronomical from its beginning, which made Rutilius say of those who euhemerized it, "Judea gent radix sultorum." But the profane, and especially Christian fanatics, ever in search of scientific corroboration for their dead-letter texts, will persist in seeing in the celestial pole the true serpent of Genesis, Satan, the enemy of mankind, instead of what it is, a cosmic metaphor. When the gods are said to forsake the earth, it does not only mean the gods, protectors and instructors, but also the minor gods, the regions of the zodiacal signs. Yet the former as actual and existing entities which gave birth to, nursed, and instructed mankind in its early youth appear in every scripture, in that of the Zoroastrians as much as in the Hindu Gospels. Ormazd, or Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, is the synthesis of the Amshaspens, or Ameshaspenta, immortal benefactors. The word, however, or the Logos and its 6 highest aspects in Mazdianism. Note on Ameshaspenta, also translated as blissful immortals by Dr. W. Geige, but the first is more correct. End of note. These immortal benefactors are described in Samyad-Yasht as the Ameshaspentas, the shining, having efficacious eyes, great, helpful, imperishable, and pure, which are all 7 of like mind, like speech, all 7 doing alike, which are the creators and destroyers of the creatures of Ahura Mazda, their creators and overseers, their protectors and rulers. These few lines alone indicate the dual and even the triple character of the Amshaspens, our Dan Kochans, or the serpents of wisdom. They are identical with, and yet separate from Ormazd, Ahura Mazda. They are also the angels of the stars of the Christians, the Stariastasas of the Zoroastrians, or again the 7 planets, including the sun of every religion. Note, these 7 became the 8, the Ogdoad, of the later materialized religions, the 7th, or the highest principle, being no longer the pervading spirit, the synthesis, but becoming an anthropomorphic number, or additional unit. End of note. The epithet, the shining having efficacious eyes, proves it. This on the physical and sidereal planes. On the spiritual, they are the divine powers of Ahura Mazda, but on the astral or psychic plane again, they are the builders, the watchers, the Pitars, fathers, and the first preceptors of mankind. When mortals shall have become sufficiently spiritualized, there will be no more need for forcing them into a correct comprehension of ancient wisdom. Men will know then that there never yet was a great world reformer, whose name has passed into our generation, who A. was not a direct emanation of the Logos, under whatever name known to us, that is, an essential incarnation of one of the 7, of the divine spirit, who is 7-fold, and B. who had not appeared before during the past cycles. They will recognize then the cause which produces in history and chronology certain riddles of the ages, the reason why, for instance, it is impossible for them to assign any reliable date to Zoroaster, who is found multiplied by 12 and 14 in the Dabishtan, why the Rishis and Manus are so mixed up in their numbers and individualities, why Krishna and Buddha speak of themselves as reincarnations, that is, Krishna is identified with the Rishi Narayana, and Gautama gives a series of his previous birth, and why the former especially, being the very supreme Brahma, is yet called Amsamsavatara, a part, only of the supreme on earth. Finally, why Osiris is a great god and at the same time a prince on earth, who reappears in Tot Hermes, and why Jesus, in Hebrew Joshua of Nazareth, is recognized Kabbalistically in Joshua, the son of Nun, as well as in other personages. The esoteric doctrine explains it by saying that each of these, as many others, had first appeared on earth as one of the 7 powers of the Logos, individualized as a god or, quote, angel, unquote, messenger. Then, mixed with matter, they had reappeared in turn as great sages and instructors who taught the 5th race, after having instructed the 2 preceding races had ruled during the divine dynasties and finally sacrificed themselves to be reborn under various circumstances for the good of mankind and for its salvation at certain critical periods, until in their last incarnations they had become truly only the parts of a part on earth, though de facto the one supreme in nature. This is the metaphysics of theogony, and as every power among the 7 has once individualized in its charge one of the elements of creation and rules over it, hence the many meanings in every symbol which, unless interpreted according to the esoteric methods, generally lead to an inextricable confusion. Note, these elements are the cosmic, the terrene, the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, the aqueous, and finally the human, in their physical, spiritual, and psychic aspects. End of note. Does the Western Kabbalist, generally an opponent of the Eastern occultist, require a proof? Let him open a life as Levi's Histoire de la Magie, page 53, and carefully examine his Grand Symbole Kabbalistique of the Zohar. He will find, on the engraving given, a white man standing erect and a black woman upside down, that is, standing on her head, her legs passing under the extended arms of the male figure and protruding behind his shoulders, while their hands join at an angle on each side. Eliphas Levi makes of it God and nature, or God, light, mirrored inversely in nature and matter, darkness. Kabbalistically and symbolically he is right, but only so far as emblematical cosmogony goes. Nor has he invented the symbol any more than the Kabbalists have. The 2 figures in white and black stone have existed in the temples of Egypt from time immemorial, agreeably to tradition, and historically, ever since the day of King Cambyses, who personally saw them. Therefore, the symbol must have been in existence since nearly 2,500 years ago. This, at the very least, for that Persian sovereign who was the son of Cyrus the Great succeeded his father in the year 529 before Christ. These figures were the 2 kabiri personifying the opposite poles. Herodotus, Talia number 77, tells posterity that when Cambyses entered the temple of the Kabirim, he went into an inextinguishable fit of laughter on perceiving what he thought a man erect and a woman standing on the top of her head before him. These were the poles, however, whose symbol was intended to commemorate the passing of the original North Pole of the earth to the South Pole of the heaven, as perceived by Mackey. Note, who adds that the Egyptians had various ways of representing the angles of the poles. Also in Paris, viewed the Levant, there is a figure representing the South Pole of the earth in the constellation of the Harp, in which the poles appear like 2 straight rods, surmounted with hawks' wings, but they were also often represented as serpents with heads of hawks, one at each end. End of note. But they represented also the poles inverted, in consequence of the great inclination of the axis, bringing each time as a result the displacement of the oceans, the submersions of the polar lands, and the consequent upheaval of new continents in the equatorial regions, and vice versa. These Kabirim were the deluge gods. This may help us to get at the key of the seemingly hopeless confusion among the numbers of names and titles given to one and the same gods, and classes of gods. Faber showed already at the beginning of this century the identity of the Corybantes, Curetes, Dioscuri, Anactes, Dii Magni, Idei Dactyli, Lares, Penates, Manes, Titans, and Alate with the Kabiri. Note on Manes. Faber and Bishop Cumberland would make them all the later pagan personifications, as the former writer has it, of the Noetic Ark, and no other than the patriarch Noah and his family, within brackets exclamation mark. See his Kabiri, volume 1, 136. because we are told after the deluge, in commemoration of the event, the pious Noachidae had established a religious festival which was later on corrupted by their impious descendants, demons or hero gods, and at length unblushing obscenity usurped the name and garb of religion. Volume 1, page 10. Now this is indeed putting an extinguisher upon the human reasoning powers, not only of antiquity, but even of our present generations. Reverse the statement and explain after the words Noah and his family that what is meant by that patriarch and family is simply the Jewish version of a Samothracian mystery of Saturn or Kronos Zodiac and his sons, and then we may say Amen. End of note. And we have shown that the latter were the same as the Manus, the Rishis, and our Diankochans, who incarnated in the elect of the third and fourth races. Thus, while in theogony the kabiri Titans were 7 great gods, cosmically and astronomically the Titans were called Atlantis, because perhaps, as Faber says, they were connected A. with the Attalas, the divine sun, and B. with Tit, the deluge. But this, if true, is only the exoteric version. Esoterically, the meaning of their symbols depends on the appellation or title used. The 7 mysterious, awe-inspiring great gods, the Dioscuri, the deities surrounded with the darkness of occult nature, become the Idi, or Idaic finger, with the adept healer by metals. Note, Dioscuri, who became later on, with the Greeks, limited only to Castor and Pollux. But in the days of Lemuria, the Dioscuri, the egg-born, were the 7 Diankochans, Agnishvata Kumara, who incarnated in the 7 elect of the third race. End of note. The true etymology of the name Lares, now signifying ghosts, must be sought in the Etruscan word Lars, conductor, leader. Sanconiaton translates the word alete as fire worshippers, and Taber believes it derived from Alorit, the god of fire. Both are right, as in both cases it is a reference to the sun, the highest god, toward whom the planetary gods gravitate, astronomically and allegorically, and whom they worship. As Lares, they are truly the solar deities, though Faber's etymology, who says that Lar is a contraction of El-Ar, the solar deity, is not very correct. They are the Lares, the conductors and leaders of men. As Alete, they were the 7 planets astronomically, and as Lares, the regions of the same, our protectors and rulers mystically. For purposes of exoteric or phallic worship, as also cosmically, they were the kabiri, their attributes being recognized in those 2 capacities by the name of the temples to which they respectively belonged, and those of their priests. They all belonged, however, to the septenary, creative, and informing groups of Diankochans, the Sabaeans, who worshipped the regents of the 7 planets, as the Hindus do their rishis, held Seth and his son Hermes, Enoch, or Enos, as the highest among the planetary gods. Seth and Enos were borrowed from the Sabaeans and then disfigured by the Jews exoterically, but the truth can still be traced about them even in Genesis. Note: Clement of Alexandria recognized the astronomical significance of chapter 25, its sequence of Exodus. According to the Mosaic doctrine, he says that the 7 planets help in the generation of terrestrial things. The 2 cherubs standing on the 2 sides of the sacred tetragrammaton represent the Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. End of note. Seth is the progenitor of those early men of the third race in whom the planetary angels had incarnated, the Diankochan himself, who belonged to the informing gods, and Enos, Hanok, or Enoch, or Hermes, was said to be his son, because it was a generic name for all the early seers, Enoikion. Thence the worship. The Arabic writer Suyuti says that the earliest records mention Seth or Set as the founder of Sabaeanism, and therefore that the pyramids which embody the planetary system were regarded as the place of sepulchre of both Seth and Idris, Hermes or Enoch. See VC, Operations, Volume 2, page 358. That thither Sabaeans proceeded on pilgrimage and chanted praise 7 times a day, turning to the north, the Mount Meru, Kap, Olympus, etc., etc., See Palgrave, Volume 2, page 264. Abd al-Latif says curious things about the Sabaeans and their books. So does Eddin Ahmed ben Yaha, who wrote 200 years later. While the latter maintains that each pyramid was consecrated to a star regent rather, Abd al-Latif assures us that he had read in Sabaean books that one pyramid was the tomb of Agathodamon and the other of Hermes. Vise Volume 2, page 342. Agathodamon was none other than Seth, and according to some writers, Hermes was his son, adds Mr. Staniland Wake in the Great Pyramid, page 57. Thus, while in Samothrace and the oldest Egyptian temples they were the great cosmic gods, the 7 and the 49 sacred fires, in the Grecian fanes their rites became mostly phallic, therefore to the profane obscene. In the latter case there were 3 and 4 or 7, the male and female principles, the crux ansata, this division showing why some classical writers held that they were only 3, while others named 4. And these were the kabiri, Axieros in his female aspect, Demeter, Axiokersia, Persephone, Axiokersos, Pluto or Hades, and Cadmus or Cadmilos, Hermes, not the ithyphallic Hermes mentioned by Herodotus in 251, but he of the sacred legend, explained only during the Samothracian mysteries. Notum Persephone, Axiokersia. It is a curious idea, yet one not very far from the truth, perhaps, that speculation on Mackey, the self-made adept of Norwich, found in his mythological astronomy. He says that the kabiri named Axerios and Axiokersia derive their names A from Kab, or Kab a measure, and from Urim the heavens, the kabiri being thus a measure of the heavens, and B that their distinctive names implying the principle of generation refer to the sexes, for the word sex was formerly understood by Aix, which has now settled into sex. And he refers to Encyclopedia Londinus at the word aspiration. Now if we give the aspirated sound to Axieros, it would be Saxieros, and the other pole would be Saxiokersia. The two poles would thus become the generators of the other powers of nature. They would be the parents, therefore the most powerful gods. End of note. This identification, due, according to the scholiast Apollon, to an indiscretion of Gnasius, is none at all, as names alone do not reveal much. There were still others again who maintained, being right in their way, that there were only 2 kabiri. These were esoterically the 2 Discuri, Castor and Pollux, and esoterically Jupiter and Bacchus. The 2 personified the terrestrial poles, geodesically, the terrestrial and the pole of the heavens, astronomically, as also the physical and the spiritual man. The story of Semele and Jupiter and the birth of Bacchus, the bee-mater, with all the circumstances attending it, needs only to be read esoterically to understand the allegory. The parts played in the event by the fire, water, earth, etc. in the many versions will show how the father of the gods and the merry god of the wine were also made to personify the 2 terrestrial poles. The telluric, metalline, magnetic, electric, and the fire elements are also many allusions and references to the cosmic and astronomic character of the Diluvian tragedy. In astronomy, the poles are indeed the heavenly measure, vide note supra, and so are the kabiri dioscuri, as will be shown, and the kabiri titans to whom Diodorus ascribes the invention of fire and the art of manufacturing iron. Note. The word Guebra comes from kabiri, gabiri, and means Persian ancient fire worshippers, or Parsis. Kabiri became Gabiri and then remained as an appellation of the Zoroastrians in Persia. See Hyde's De Religio Persarum, 29. End of note. Moreover, Pausanias shows that the original Kabiric deity was Prometheus, Volume 1, Chapter 9, page 751. But the fact that astronomically the Titans Kabirim were also the generators and regulators of the seasons, and cosmically the great volcanic energies, the gods presiding over all the metals and terrestrial works, does not prevent them from being, in their original divine characters, the beneficent entities who, symbolized in Prometheus, brought light to the world, and endowed humanity with intellect and reason. They are preeminently in every theogony, especially in the Hindu, the sacred divine fires, 3, 7, or 49, according as the allegory demands it. Their very names prove it, as they are the Agniputra, sons of the fire, in India, and the genii of the fire under numerous names in Greece and elsewhere. Velke, Mori, and now Decanum show the name Kabirian meaning the powerful through fire, from the Greek word kaio, to burn, the Semitic kabirim, the powerful, the mighty, and the great, answering to the Greek megaloi. When incarnated as kings of the divine dynasties, they gave the first impulse to civilizations and directed the mind with which they had endued men to the invention and perfection of all the arts and sciences. Thus the kabiri are said to have appeared as the benefactors of men, and as such they lived for ages in the memory of nations. To them, the kabiri or titans, is ascribed the invention of letters, the Devanagari, or the alphabet and language of the gods, of laws and legislature, of architecture, as of the various modes of magic so-called, and of the medical use of plants. Hermes, Orpheus, Cadmus, Asclepius, all those demi-gods and heroes to whom is ascribed the revelation of sciences to men, and in whom Bryant, Faber, Bishop Cumberland, and so many other Christian writers, too zealous for plain truth, would force posterity to see only pagan copies of one and sole prototype, named Noah, are all generic names. It is the kabiri who are credited with having revealed, by producing corn or wheat, the great boon of agriculture. What Isis Osiris, the once living Kabiria, had done in Egypt, that Ceres is said to have done in Sicily. They all belong to one class. That the serpents were ever the emblems of wisdom and prudence is again shown by the caduceus of Mercury, one with Tot, the god of wisdom, with Hermes, and so on. The two serpents, entwined around the rod, are phallic symbols of Jupiter and other gods who transformed themselves into snakes for purposes of seducing goddesses, but only in the unclean fancies of profane symbologists. The serpent has ever been the symbol of the adept and of his powers of immortality and divine knowledge. Mercury, in his psychopompic character, conducting and guiding with the caduceus the souls of the dead to Hades, and even raising the dead to life with it, is simply a very transparent allegory. It shows the dual power of the secret wisdom, the black and the white magic. It shows this personified wisdom guiding the soul after death, and its power to call to life that which is dead, a very deep metaphor if one thinks over its meaning. Every people of antiquity reverenced this symbol, with the exception of Christians, who chose to forget the brazen serpent of Moses, and even the implied acknowledgment of the great wisdom and prudence of the serpent by Jesus himself. Be ye wise as serpents, and harmless as doves. The Chinese, one of the oldest nations of our fifth race, made of it the emblem of their emperors, who are thus the degenerate successors of the serpents, or initiates, who ruled the early races of the fifth humanity. The emperor's throne is a dragon's seat, and his dresses of state are embroidered with the likeness of the dragon. The aphorisms in the oldest books of China, moreover, say plainly that the dragon is a human, albeit divine being. Speaking of the yellow dragon, the chief of the others, the Tuang Ying Tu says, his wisdom and virtue are unfathomable. He does not go in company and does not live in herds. He is an ascetic. He wanders in the wilds beyond the heavens. He goes and comes, fulfilling the decree, karma. At the proper seasons, if there is a perfection, he comes forth. If not, he remains invisible. Unquote. And Kung Fu Chu is made to say by Lu Lan, quote, the dragon feeds in the pure water of wisdom and sports in the clear waters of life. Unquote. Our divine instructors. Now Atlantis and the Phlegian Isle are not the only record that is left of the deluge. China has also her tradition and the story of an island or continent, which it calls Malin Gasima, and which Kempfer and Faber spell Maurigoshima for some mysterious phonetic reasons of their own. Kempfer, in his Japan, appendix page 13, gives the tradition. The island, owing to the iniquity of its giants, sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and Peiru Un, the king, the Chinese Noah, escapes alone with his family, owing to a warning of the gods through 2 idols. It is that pious prince and his descendants who have peopled China. The Chinese traditions speak of the divine dynasties of kings as much as those of any other nations. At the same time, there is not an old fragment but shows belief in a multiform and even multigeneric evolution, spiritual, psychic, intellectual, and physical, of human beings, just as given in the present work. A few of these claims are now to be considered. Our races, they all show, have sprung from divine races, by whatever name they are called. Whether we deal with the Indian Rishis or Pitris, with the Chinese Jimnyang and Changi, they are divine man and demigods, with the Akkadian Dingir and Mullil, the creative god and the gods of the ghost world, with the Egyptian Isis Osiris and Tot, with the Hebrew Elohim, or again with Manco Capac and his Peruvian progeny. The story varies nowhere. Every nation has either the 7 and 10 rishis, manus, and prajapatis, the 7 and 10 kiyu, or 10 and 7 amshaspans, 6 esoterically, 10 and 7 Chaldean anidots, 10 and 7 sephiroth, etc., etc. Note, the amshaspans are 6. If Ormazd, their chief and logos, is excluded, but in the secret doctrine he is the 7th and highest, just as Ptah is the 7th kabir among the kabiri. End of note. One and all have been derived from the primitive Giancochans of the esoteric doctrine, or the builders of the stanzas, Book 1. From Manu, taught Hermes, Oannes Dagon, and Edris Enoch, down to Plato and Panadoris, all tell us of 7 divine dynasties, of 7 Lemurian and 7 Atlantean divisions of the earth, of the 7 primitive and dual gods who descend from their celestial abode and reign on earth, teaching mankind astronomy, architecture, and all the other sciences that have come down to us. Note on the celestial abode. In the Purana it is identified with Vishnu's or Brahma's Svetadvipa of Mount Meru. End of note. These beings appear first as gods and creators. Then they emerge in nascent man, to finally emerge as divine kings and rulers. But this fact has been gradually forgotten. As Bouzage shows, the Egyptians themselves confessed that science flourished in their country only since Isis Osiris, whom they continue to adore as gods, though they had become princes in human form. And he adds of Osiris, Isis, the divine androgyne, it is said that this prince, Isis Osiris, built cities in Egypt, stopped the overflowing of the Nile, invented agriculture, the use of the vine, music, astronomy, and geometry. When Abul Feda says in his Historia Anti-Islamitica, Fleischer, page 16, that the Sabaean language was established by Seth and Edris, Enoch, he means by Sabaean language astronomy. In the Melelvanochil, Hermes is called the disciple of Agathodamon, and in another account, see Colonel Weiss, 2nd volume of the Pyramids of Gizeh, page 364, manuscript 785. Agathodamon is mentioned as a king of Egypt. Selepas Geraldinus gives curious traditions about Enoch. He calls him the divine giant. In the book of the various names of the Nile, the same author, the historian Ahmed ben Yusuf el-Tifas, tells us of the belief among the Semitic Arabs that Seth, become later the Egyptian Typhon Set, had been one of the 7 angels or patriarchs in the Bible. Then he became immortal and Adam's son, after which he communicated the gift of prophecy and astronomical science to Jared, who passed it to his son Enoch. But Enoch, Idris, the author of 30 books, was Sabaean by origin, that is, belonging to the Saba, a host. Having established the rites and ceremonies of primitive worship, he went to the east, where he constructed 140 cities, of which Edessa was the least important, then returned to Egypt, where he became its king. Thus he is identified with Hermes. But there were 5 Hermes, or rather one who appeared as some Manichaean rishis did in several different characters. In the Buramikati he is mentioned as Hormik, a name of the planet Mercury or Buda, and Wednesday was sacred both to Hermes and Tot. The Hermes of Oriental tradition worshipped at Phinata and said to have fled after the death of Argus into Egypt, civilized it under the name of Tot. But under whichever of these characters, he is always credited with having transferred all the sciences from latent to active potency, that is, with having been the first to teach magic to Egypt and to Greece, before the days of Magna Graecia, and when the Greeks were not even Hellenes. Not only Herodotus, the father of history, tells us of the marvelous dynasties of gods that preceded the reign of mortals, followed by the dynasties of demigods, heroes, and finally men, but the whole series of classics support him. Diodorus, Eratosthenes, Plato, Manetho, etc., etc. repeat the same, and never vary the order given. It is indeed, as Kreutzer shows, from the spheres of the stars wherein dwell the gods of light that wisdom descends to the inferior spheres. In the system of the ancient priests, hierophants, and adepts, all things without exception, gods, the genii, manes, that is souls, the whole world, are conjointly developed in space and duration. The pyramid may be considered as the symbol of this magnificent hierarchy of spirits. Note, Chapter 4 of Egypt, page 441. End of note. There were more efforts made by the modern historians, French academicians like Renan chiefly, to suppress truth by ignoring the ancient annals of divine kings than is strictly consistent with dynasty. But Monsieur Renan could never be more unwilling than was Eratosthenes 260 years before Christ to accept the unpalatable fact, and yet the latter found himself obliged to recognize its truth. For this, the great astronomer is treated with great contempt by his colleagues 2,000 years later. Manetho became with them a superstitious priest born and bred in the atmosphere of other lying priests of Heliopolis, writes Ferré. All those historians and priests, justly remarks the demonologist de Merville, so veracious when repeating stories of human kings and men, suddenly become extremely suspicious no sooner do they go back to their gods. But there is the synchronistic table of Abydos, which, thanks to the genius of Champollion, has now vindicated the good faith of the priests of Egypt, Manethos above all, and that of Ptolemy. In the Tyrian papyrus, the most remarkable of all, in the words of the Egyptologist de Rouget, quote, Champollion, struck with amazement, found that he had under his own eyes the whole truth. It was the remains of a list of dynasties embracing the furthest mythoic times, or the reign of the gods and heroes. At the very outset of this curious papyrus, we have to arrive at the conviction that so far back already as the period Ramses, those mythic and heroical traditions were just as Manetho had transmitted them to us. We see figuring in them as kings of Egypt the gods of Seb, Osiris, Horus, Tot, Hermes, and the goddess Ma, a long period of centuries being assigned to the reign of each of these. Unquote. From Année de Philologie Chrétienne, volume 32, page 442. The synchronistic tables of Manetho, besides the fact that they were disfigured by Eusebius for dishonest purposes, had never gone beyond Manetho. The chronology of the divine kings and dynasties, like that of the age of humanity, has ever been in the hands of the priests, and was kept secret from the profane multitudes. Africa as a continent, it is said, appeared before Europe did. Nevertheless, it appeared later than Lemuria and even the earliest Atlantis. That the whole region of what is now Egypt and the deserts was once upon a time covered with the sea was known firstly through Herodotus, Strabo, Pliny, and all the Greeks, and secondly through geology. Abyssinia was once upon a time an island. and the Delta was the first country occupied by the pioneer immigrants who came with their gods from the northeast. When was it? History is silent upon the subject. Fortunately, we have the Dendera Zodiac, the planisphere of the ceiling of one of the oldest Egyptian temples, which records the fact. This zodiac, with its mysterious 3 Virgos between the Lion and Libra, has found its Oedipus, who understood the riddle of these signs, and justified the truthfulness of those priests who told Herodotus that A, the poles of the earth and the ecliptic had formerly coincided, and B, that even since their first zodiacal records were commenced, the poles have been 3 times within the plane of the ecliptic, as the initiates taught. Bei had not sufficient words at his command to express his surprise at the sameness of all such traditions about the divine races. What are, finally, he exclaims, all those reigns of Indian devas and Persian Peris, or those reigns and dynasties of the Chinese legends, those Qian Huang, or the kings of heaven, quite distinct from the Ti Huang, the kings on earth, and the Jing Huang, the king's men, a distinction which is in perfect accord with that other one made by the Greeks and the Egyptians in enumerating their dynasties of gods, of demigods, and of mortals." Unquote. Note, from Histoire de l'astronomie ancienne. End of note. Now, says Pandoras, it is better that time, Menes, that the reign of the 7 gods who rule the world took place. It was during that period that those benefactors of humanity descended on earth and taught men to calculate the course of the sun and moon by the 12 signs of the ecliptic. Nearly 500 years before the actual era, Herodotus was shown by the priests of Egypt the statues of their human kings and pontiffs pyramids, the archi-prophets, or Mahakohans of the temples, born one from the other, without the intervention of woman, who had reigned before Menes, their first human king. These statues, he says, were enormous colossi in wood, 345 in number, each of which had his name, his history, and his annals. And they assured Herodotus, unless the most truthful of historians, the father of history, is now accused of fibbling, just in this instance, that no historian could ever understand or write an account of these superhuman kings unless he had studied and learned the history of the 3 dynasties that preceded the human, namely the dynasties of the gods, that of demigods, and of the heroes, or giants. These 3 dynasties are the 3 races. Translated into the language of the esoteric doctrine, these 3 dynasties would also be those of the Devas, of Kimpurushas, and of Danavas and Daityas, otherwise gods, celestial spirits, and giants or titans. Happy are those who are born even from the condition of gods as men, in Bharatavarsha, exclaim the incarnated gods themselves during the 3rd root race. Bharata is India, but in this case it symbolized the chosen land in those days and was considered the best of the divisions of the Jambudvipa, as it was the land of active spiritual works par excellence, the land of initiation and of divine knowledge. Can one fail to recognize in Koitse great powers of intuition when, being almost unacquainted with the Aryan Hindu philosophies, little known in his day, he wrote, "We, modern Europeans, feel surprised when hearing talk of the spirits of the sun, moon, etc., but we repeat again, the natural good sense and the upright judgment of the ancient peoples, quite foreign to our entirely material ideas upon celestial mechanics and physical sciences, could not see in the stars and planets only that which we see, namely simple masses of light, or opaque bodies moving in circuits in sidereal space, merely according to the laws of attraction or repulsion. But they saw in them living bodies animated by spirits, as they saw the same in every kingdom of nature. This doctrine of spirits, so consistent and conformable to nature from which it was derived, formed a grand and unique conception, wherein the physical, the moral, and the political aspects were all blended together." Egypt, pages 450 to 455. Note: In the Vishnu Purana, Book 2, Chapter 3, 4, etc., may be found many corroborations of the same if one reads carefully. The reigns of gods, lower gods, and men are all enumerated in the descriptions of the 7 islands, 7 seas, 7 mountains, etc., etc., ruled by kings. Each king is said invariably to have 7 sons, an allusion to the 7 sub-races. One instance will do. The king of Kushadvipa had 7 sons, follow names, after whom the 7 portions, Varsha, of the island were called. There reside mankind along with the Daityas and Danavas, as well as with spirits of heaven, Gandharvas, Yakshas, Kimpurushas, etc., and gods, from chapter 4. There is but one exception in the case of King Priyavrata, the son of the first Manu, Swayambhuva, who had 10 sons, but of these 3, Medha, Agnibahu, and Putra, became ascetics and refused their portions. Thus Priyavrata divided the earth again into 7 continents. End of note. But he was not the first nor last to believe the same, and he had been preceded and anticipated in this theory by Father Kircher. This learned Jesuit writes in Oedipus Egyptico, Volume 1, page 70, "I confess for a long time I had regarded all these, dynasties and the Atlantis, as pure fables, meras nugas. To the day when, better instructed in Oriental languages, I judged that all those legends must be after all only the development of a great truth." Unquote. As de Rougemont shows, Theopompu, in his Merope, made the priests of Phrygia and Asia Minor speak exactly as the priests of Thais did, when they revealed to Solon the history and fate of Atlantis. According to Theopompu, it was a unique continent of an indefinite size and containing 2 countries inhabited by 2 races, a fighting warrior race and a pious meditative race, which Theopompu symbolizes by 2 cities. Notes: the races. These were the earlier Aryans and the bulk of the 4th root races, the former pious and meditative, yoga contemplation, the latter a fighting race of sorcerers who are rapidly degenerating owing to their uncontrolled passions. And the 2 cities, the northern and southern divisions of Lemuria Atlantis, the Hyperborean and the equatorial lands of the 2 continents. See sections about Lemuria and Atlantis in history. End of notes. The pious, quote, city, unquote, was continually visited by the gods. The belligerent, quote, city, unquote, was inhabited by various beings invulnerable to iron, liable to be mortally wounded only by stone and wood. Note: this is a cult, and refers to the property of iron which, attracted by magnetic elements, is repelled by others, which are made by an occult process as impervious to it as water to a blow. End of note. De Rougemont treats this as a pure fiction of Theopompu, Peuple Primitif, Volume 3, 157, and even sees a fraud, supercherie, in the assertion of the Saitic priests. This was denounced by the, quote, demonologists, unquote, as illogical. In the words of de Merville, a supercherie which was based on a belief, the product of faith, of the whole antiquity, a supposition which yet gave its name to a whole mountain chain, the Atlas, which specified with the greatest precision a topographical region by placing some of its lands at a small distance from Cadiz and the Strait of Calpetus, which prophesied 2,000 years before Columbus the great transoceanic land situated beyond that Atlantis, and which is reached, it said, by the islands not of the blessed, but of the good spirits, our îles fortunées. Such a supposition can never be an universal chimera. A word in Atlantis, page 29. It is certain that, with a chimera reality, the priests of the whole world had it from one and the same source, the universal tradition about the 3rd great continent, which perished some 850,000 years ago. Note, the first continent or island, if so preferred, the cap of the North Pole, has never perished, nor will it to the end of the 7 races. End of note. A continent inhabited by 2 distinct races, distinct physically and especially morally, both deeply versed in primeval wisdom and the secrets of nature, mutually antagonistic in their struggle during the course and progress of their double evolution. Whence even the Chinese teachings upon the subject, if it is but a fiction? Have they not recorded the existence once upon a time of a holy island beyond the sun, Tku, and beyond which were situated the lands of the immortal men? See Dérougemont from the same source. Do they not still believe that the remnants of all those immortal men who survived when the holy island had become black with sin and perished, have found refuge in the great desert of Gobi, where they still reside invisible to all and defended from approach by hosts of spirits? If one has to lend ear to traditions, writes the very unbelieving Boulanger, a Reine de Dieu introduction, the latter place before the reign of kings, that of the heroes and demigods, and still earlier and beyond the place the marvelous reign of the gods and all the fables of the Golden Age, one feels surprised that annals so interesting should have been rejected by almost all our historians. And yet the ideas communicated by them were once universally admitted and revered by all the peoples. Not a few revere them still, making them the basis of their daily life. Such considerations seems to necessitate a less hurried judgment. The ancients, from whom we hold these traditions, which we accept no longer because we do not understand them now, must have had motives for believing in them furnished by their greater proximity to the first ages, and which the distance that separates us from them refuses to us. Plato, in his 4th book of Laws, says that long before the construction of the first cities, Saturn had established on earth a certain form of government under which man was very happy. As it is the Golden Age he refers to, or to that reign of gods so celebrated in ancient fables, let us see the ideas he had of that happy age, and what was the occasion he had to introduce this fable into a treatise on politics. According to Plato, in order to obtain clear and precise ideas on royalty, its origin and power, one has to turn back to the first principles of history and tradition. Great changes, he says, have occurred in days of old, in heaven and on earth, and the present state of things is one of the results, karma. Our traditions tell us of many marvels, of changes that have taken place in the course of the sun, of Saturn's reign, and of 1,000 other matters that remain scattered about in human memory. But one never hears anything of the evil which has produced such revolutions, nor of the evil which directly followed them. Yet that evil is the principle one has to talk about, to be able to treat royalty and the origin of power. That evil Plato seems to see in the sameness or consubstantiality of the natures of the rulers and the ruled, for he says that long before man built his cities, in the Golden Age there was naught but happiness on earth, for there were no needs. Why? Because Saturn, knowing that man could not rule man without injustice filling forthwith the universe through his whims and vanity, would not allow any mortal to obtain power over his fellow creatures. To do this, the god used the same means we use ourselves with regard to our flocks. We do not place a bullock or a ram over our bullocks and rams, but give them a leader, a shepherd, that is, a being of a species quite different from their own and of a superior nature. It is just what Saturn did. He loved mankind, and placed to rule over it no mortal king or prince, but spirits and genii, daimones, of a divine nature more excellent than that of man. It was God, the Logos, the synthesis of the host, who thus presiding over the genii became the first shepherd and leader of men. Note, The secret doctrine explains and expounds that which Plato says, for it teaches that those inventors were gods and demigods, devas and rishis, who had become, some deliberately, some forced to by karma, incarnated in man. End of note. When the world had ceased to be so governed and the gods retired, ferocious beasts devoured a portion of mankind. Left to their own resources and industry, inventors then appeared among them successively and discovered fire, wheat, wine, and public gratitude deified them. De Legibus, Book 1, Chapter 4. And mankind was right, as fire by friction was the first mystery of nature, the first and chief property of matter that was revealed to man. Quote, fruit and grain unknown to earth to that day were brought by the lords of wisdom for the benefit of those they ruled, from other lokas, spheres, unquote, say the commentaries. Now, quote, the earliest inventions, within brackets question mark, of mankind are the most wonderful that the race has ever made. The first use of fire and the discovery of the methods by which it can be kindled, the domestication of animals, and above all, the processes by which the various cereals were first developed out of some wild grasses, within brackets question mark. These are discoveries with which ingenuity and in importance no subsequent discoveries may compare. They are all unknown to history, all lost in the light of an effulgent dawn, unquote from Unity of Nature by Agrill. This will be doubted and denied in our proud generation, but if it is asserted that there are no grains and fruits unknown to earth, then we may remind the reader that wheat has never been found in the wild state. It is not a product of the earth. All the other cereals have been traced to their primogenital forms in various species of wild grasses, but wheat has hitherto defied the efforts of botanists to trace it to its origin. And let us bear in mind, in this connection, how sacred was that cereal with the Egyptian priests, wheat being placed even with their mummies, and found thousands of years later in their coffins. Remember, the servants of Horus glean the wheat in the field of Anru, wheat 7 cubits high, from Book of the Dead, chapter 99, verse 33, and 156, verse 4. Note: this is a direct reference to the esoteric division of man's principles symbolized by the divine wheat. The legend which inscribes the third register of the papyrus in chapter 110 of the Book of the Dead states, this is the region of the manes, disembodied men, 7 cubits high, to wit, those just translated and supported to be still sevenfold, with all their principles, even the body represented astrally in the Kamaloka or Hades, before their separation. And there is a wheat 3 cubits high for mummies in a state of perfection, that is, those already separated, whose 3 higher principles are in Devakan, who are permitted to glean it. This region, Devakan, is called the land of the rebirth of gods, and shown to be inhabited by Skeu, Tefnut, and Seb. The region for the manes 7 cubits high, for the yet imperfect mummies, and the region for those in a state of perfection, who glean wheat 3 cubits high, is as clear as possible. The Egyptians had the same esoteric philosophy which is now taught by the Chismalian adepts, who, when buried, have corn and wheat placed over them. End of note. The reader is referred to stanza 7, verse 3 in Book 1, wherein this verse is explained in another of its meanings, and also the Book of the Dead, chapter 109, verse 4 and 5. I am the queen of these regions, says the Egyptian Isis. I was the first to reveal to mortals the mysteries of wheat and corn. I am she who rises in the constellation of the dog star. Rejoice, O Egypt, thou who wert my nurse. Book 1, chapter 14. Note: there are Egyptologists who have tried to identify Osiris with Menes, which is quite erroneous. Bunsen assigns to Menes an antiquity of 5,867 years before Christ, and is denounced for it by Christians. But Isis Osiris reigned in Egypt before the Dendera Zodiac was painted on the ceiling of that temple, and that is over 75,000 years ago. End of note. Sirius was called the Dog Star. It was the star of Mercury, or Buddha, called the great instructor of mankind, before other Buddhas. The book of the Chinese I Ching attributes the discovery of agriculture to the instruction given to men by celestial genii. Woe, woe to the men who know naught, observe naught, nor will they see. They are all blind, since they remain ignorant how much the world is full of various and invisible creatures which crowd even in the most sacred places. From Zohar part 1, column 177, note in the text corked up or screwed up, instead of they are all blind. End of note. The sons of God have existed and do exist. From the Hindu Brahmaputras and Manasaputras, sons of Brahma and mind-born sons, down to the Bnei Elohim of the Jewish Bible, the faith of the centuries and universal tradition force reason to yield such evidence. Of what value is independent criticism, so-called, or internal evidence, based usually on the respective hobbies of the critics, in the face of the universal testimony which never varied throughout the historical cycles? Read esoterically the 6th chapter of Genesis, which repeats the statements of the secret doctrine, only changing slightly its form and drawing a different conclusion, which clashes even with the Zohar. Quote, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God, Bnei Elohim, came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown, unquote. Or giants. Note. See Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. End of note. What does this sentence, quote, and also after that, unquote, signify, unless it means, when explained, there were giants in the earth before, that is, before the sinless sons of the third race, and also after that, when other sons of God, lower in nature, inaugurated sexual connection on earth, as Daksha did, when he saw that his Manasaputras would not people the earth. And then comes a long break in this chapter 6 of Genesis, between verses 4 and 5, for surely it was not in or through the wickedness of the mighty men of renown, among whom is placed Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, that God saw that the wickedness of man was great, nor in the builders of Babel, for this was after the deluge, but in the progeny of the giants, who produced monstra quaedam de genere giganteo, monsters from whence sprang the lower races of men, now represented on earth by a few miserable dying-out tribes and the huge anthropoid apes. And if we are taken to task by theologians, whether Protestant or Roman Catholic, we have only to refer them to their own literal texts. The above-quoted verse was ever a dilemma, not alone for the men of science and biblical scholars, but also for priests. For, as the Reverend Father Perron puts it, either they, the Bnei Elohim, were good angels, and in such case how could they fall? Or they were bad angels, and in this case could not be called Bnei Elohim, the sons of God. Unquote. The biblical riddle, quote, the real sense of which no author has ever understood, unquote, as candidly confessed by Fourmont in Réflexions critiques sur l'origine des anciens peuples, can only be explained by the occult doctrine, through the Zohar to the Western and the Book of John to the Eastern. What the former says we have seen. What the Zohar tells us is this. Bnei Elohim was a name common to the Malachim, the good messengers, and to the Ishin, the lower angels, says Rabbi Parker. We may add, for the benefit of the demonologists, that their Satan, the adversary, is included in Job among the sons of God, or Bnei Alem who visit their father, in chapter 1. But of this later on. Now the Zohar says that the Ishkin, the beautiful Bnei Alem, were not guilty, but mixed themselves with mortal men, because they were sent on earth to do so, from the book of Ruth and Skadash. Elsewhere, the same volume shows these Bnei Alem belonging to the 10th subdivision of the thrones. It also explains that the Ishin, men spirits, viri spirituales, now that men can see them no longer, help magicians to produce, through their science, homunculi, which are not small men, but men smaller in the sense of inferiority than men. Both show themselves under the form that the Ishin had then, that is, gaseous and ethereal. Their chief is Azazel. But Azazel, whom the church dogma will associate with Satan, is nothing of the kind. Azazel is a mystery, as explained elsewhere, and it is so expressed in Maimonides, in More Nevokim, chapter 26, page 8. There is an impenetrable mystery in the narrative concerning Azazel. And so there is, as Lanki, a librarian to the Vatican, and one who ought to know, says, we have quoted him before, that this venerable divine name, nome divino e venerabile, has become through the pen of the biblical scholars a devil, a wilderness, a mountain, and a he-goat, from Sagra Scriptura. Therefore it seems foolish to derive the name, as Spencer does, from Ajal, separated, and El, God, hence once separated from God, the devil. In the Zohar, Azazel is rather the sacrificial victim than the formal adversary of Jehovah, as Spencer would have it. The amount of malicious fancy and fiction bestowed on that host by various fanatical writers is quite extraordinary. Azazel and his host are simply the Hebrew Prometheus, and ought to be viewed from the same standpoint. The Zohar shows the Ishkin chained on the mountain in the desert, allegorically, thus simply alluding to those spirits as being chained to the earth during the cycle of incarnation. Azazel, or Azaziel, is one of the chiefs of the transgressing angels in Enoch, who, descending upon Ardis, the top of Mount Armon, bound themselves by swearing loyalty to each other. It is said that Azaziel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, to fabricate mirrors, within brackets question mark, to make one see what is behind him, meaning, quote, magic mirrors, unquote. Amazarak taught all the sorcerers and dividers of roots. Amers taught the solution of magic. Barkayal, astrology. Akibel, the meaning of portents and signs. Tamyal, astronomy. And Asaradel taught the motion of the moon. These 7 were the first instructors of the fourth man, that is, of the fourth race. But why should allegory be always understood as meaning all that its dead letter expresses? It is the symbolical representation of the great struggle between divine wisdom, nous, and its earthly reflection, psyche, or between spirit and soul in heaven and on earth. In heaven, because the divine monad had voluntarily exiled itself therefrom to descend for incarnating purposes to a low plane and thus transform the animal of clay into an immortal god. For, as Eliphas Levi tells us, the angels aspire to become men. For the perfect man, the man-god is above even angels. On earth, because no sooner had spirit descended than it was strangled in the coils of matter. Strange to say, the occult teaching reverses the characters. It is the anthropomorphous archangel with the Christians and the man-like god with the Hindus which represent matter in this case, and the dragon or serpent, spirit. Occult symbolism furnishes the key to the mystery. Theological symbolics conceal it still more, for the former explains many sayings in the Bible and even in the New Testament which have hitherto remained incomprehensible, while the latter, owing to its dogma of Satan and his rebellion, has belittled the character and nature of its would-be infinite, absolutely perfect God, and created the greatest evil and curse on earth, belief in a personal devil. This mystery is opened with the key to its metaphysical symbolism, now restored, while that of theological interpretation shows the gods and the archangels standing as symbols for the dead letter or dogmatic religions, and as arrayed against the pure truths of spirit, naked and unadorned with fancy. Many were the hints thrown out in this direction in Isis Unveiled, and a still greater number of references to this mystery may be found scattered throughout these volumes. To make the point clear once for all, that which the clergy of every dogmatic religion, preeminently the Christian, points out as Satan, the enemy of God, is in reality the highest divine spirit, occult wisdom on earth, in its naturally antagonistic character to every worldly, evanescent illusion, dogmatic or ecclesiastical religions included. Thus the Latin Church, intolerant, bigoted, and cruel to all who do not choose to be its slaves, the Church which calls itself the Bride of Christ, and the trustee at the same time of Peter, to whom the rebuke of the Master, "Get thee behind me, Satan," was justly addressed. And again the Protestant Church which, while calling itself Christian, paradoxically replaces the new dispensation by the old law of Moses, which Christ openly repudiated. Both these churches are fighting against divine truth when repudiating and slandering the dragon of esoteric, because divine, wisdom. Whenever anathematizing the Gnostic sola knupfis, the agathodaemon Christos, or the theosophical serpent of eternity, or even the serpent of Genesis, they are moved by the same spirit of dog fanaticism that moved the Pharisees to curse Jesus by saying to him, "Say we not, well, thou hast a devil." Read the account about Indra, Vayu, in the Rig Veda, the occult volume par excellence of Arianism, and then compare it with the same in the Puranas, the exoteric version thereof, and the purposely garbled account of the true wisdom religion. In the Rig Veda, Indra is the highest and greatest of the gods, and his soma drinking is allegorical of his highly spiritual nature. In the Puranas, Indra becomes a profligate and a regular drunkard on the soma juice in the terrestrial way. He is the conqueror of all the enemies of the gods, the Daityas, Nagas, serpents, Asuras, and the serpent gods, and of Varitri, the cosmic serpent. Indra is the Saint Michael of the Hindu pantheon, the chief of the militant host. Turning to the Bible, we find Satan, one of the sons of God, see Job 1, verse 6, becoming, in exoteric interpretation, the devil, and the dragon in its infernal evil sense. But in the Kabbalah, in Book of Numbers, Samuel, who is Satan, is shown to be identical with Saint Michael, the slayer of the dragon. How is this? For it is said that Tselem, the image, reflects alike Michael and Samuel, who are one. Both proceed, it is taught, from Ruach, spirit, Nechmach, soul, and Nephesh, life. In the Chaldean Book of Numbers, Samuel is the concealed occult wisdom, and Michael the higher terrestrial wisdom, both emanating from the same source but diverging after their issue from the mundane soul, which on earth is Mahat, intellectual understanding, or Manas, the seat of intellect. They diverge because one, Michael, is influenced by Nishmach, while the other, Samuel, remains uninfluenced. This tenet was perverted by the dogmatic spirit of the Church, which, loathing independent spirit, uninfluenced by external form, hence by dogma, forthwith made of Samuel Satan, the most wise and spiritual spirit of all, the adversary of his anthropomorphic God, and sensual, physical man, the devil. Next up is Stanza 12 continued with the origin of the satanic myth.